Dzień dobry, witam Państwa serdecznie na 60. Krakowskim Festiwalu Filmowym, który w tym roku odbywa się online. To już kolejny dzień, kolejna partia fascynujących rozmów i oczywiście pokazów filmowych. Witam Cię, Kaju, dzień dobry. Za moment będziesz po raz kolejny rozmawiać z fantastycznymi naszymi gośćmi. Welcome Dan and Vivian, the director and producer of the Changin Ti of Ike'a White'a. Where are you now? What city? Where?
Viv, you go first.
I'm in London.
I'm in London. Okay.
East London.
And I'm by the south coast in Brighton.
Okay. So, yes, we're in Poland, so welcome to Krakow Festival. Just let me say that it's so pity that we can't meet in person here in our beautiful city at the festival, but I hope next time you will visit us. So have a good conversation now and join us for the online festival, since some events are available for everybody in the world. So yes, bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you, bye. Okay, so first few words in Polish, excuse me. Dzień dobry drodzy Państwo, Kaja Klimek, jak zawsze w festiwalowym nastroju i anturażu. Akredytacja z zeszłego roku, ale podbija to zawsze stawkę i czujemy się trochę bardziej tak, jakbyśmy się spotykali w Krakowie. Ze mną autorzy filmu, Basia już ich przedstawiła, więc już nie będę w to wchodzić. Cieszę się, że jesteście z nami i że porozmawiamy o filmie Burzliwe, życie Ike'a White'a. So, that was in Polish. I guess you don't understand a thing, but I was flashing my accreditation from last year because that always brings up the festival spirit a bit, this badges that we always wear around wrists or whatever. And I'm really happy that we have a chance to talk about your film, The Changing Times of Ike'a White. I also really like the Polish version of the title, which is a bit different, as you may know. It's Turmoiled Life of Ike'a White, actually. So it makes it more focused on the person than on the music in a way, because of course we know that Changing Times is also the title of a song and so on and so forth. So welcome, and I'm really happy that we can have a conversation about the film. But to be honest, I did some research on Ike'a White. No Wikipedia page, at least I didn't find it. No music on Spotify. So what happened? Like, how did you manage to? I put his name on Who Sampled Who, because that always helps, because you can discover the samples that other artists were using of music of other musicians. It's also like generated by the community around music. So I found his name in there. But apart from that, and apart from your film, no trace. Maybe 2 or 3 songs on YouTube connected with some other like playlists of music from the 70s, and that's it. So who of you and how did discover even that guy? How did it happen? Because it feels like, you know, like did you find an album somewhere? Like, I can imagine this story that there's like this beautiful shop in London somewhere and you are going through vinyl records, and then this beautiful face of that guy comes up and you are like, who's that? Let me listen to this. But that's my imagination, of course. So I wondered how it really came about that you even discovered this guy, if he's so undiscoverable. Let me just like say it that way.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't that far off, actually. I was given a sort of album, a compilation of music that was made in prisons. A friend of mine's a very sort of avid record collector, and he said, have a listen to this. And I listened to it, and some of the tracks were okay, some of them were a bit derivative, and there was one track that really stood out, which was Changing Times. So I didn't even get to see his face in the first instance. I didn't see that beautiful face. All I heard was that amazing voice, and I listened to it and I thought, this is an incredible piece of music, and his voice and the yearning and the lyrics and the sort of orchestration of the track really spoke to me. And that was the beginning of the search for Ike'a White. I just became slightly obsessed with finding him and ended up dialing all the Ike'a Whites in the white pages, which is the equivalent of the kind of phone book in the States, to try and get hold of this guy, asking people, you know, is your name Ike'a White? were you in prison? Because at that point I knew that he'd been inside San Quentin. I did a bit of research another way, and getting some pretty hostile responses sometimes. But that was the beginning of the story of how we started this documentary.
Mm-hmm. But it's really interesting that it's this kind of like almost analog research, that you really have to go to people and ask them, are you this Ike'a White'a that I listened the record of? And we are living in 21st century, so it feels like, this quote, if something isn't online, it doesn't really exist, or something like this. And this guy is like completely, and was completely analog in that manner, I would say. So this is also really interesting on that level.
And it was a really satisfying quest as a journalist for it not to be information that was at your fingertips. I mean, there were all these rumors that a friend of mine, because there's a record buying community that sort of, turns out that Changing Times is a well-known track. The album's a record collector's sort of rarity. And there's another track on the album called Love and Affection, which is a big break that DJs sample. And there were all these rumors that he was in Hawaii, that he was part of a gang, that he joined the circus, that he was dead. So the sort of the journalist in you that's like, okay, it's the hardest thing I've ever done. It's all the more satisfying then when we actually did manage to find him.
Mm-hmm. So on some level, you decided that, okay, I have enough to start this project. And were you already in touch with him at this point in time, or that came later when Dan was already on board? What was and of course, like when Dan jumped on the train to meet Ike'a White'a?
Well, what happened was eventually we found the link between Ike'a White'a and David Maestro through Greg Errico, who is the drummer, and he's also the producer on the album. I got in touch with him. You go through the back of the album and those are your clues. So got in touch with him, and he had that name. And then it was a faster trip to find him, because he did have I think it was a YouTube page and the performance that you see in the film. So I had managed to get in touch with him. He'd been extremely worried about anybody knowing his identity, because it had been in prison, and on his release, it had been an amazing sort of point of difference as an artist, but it had become quite an albatross around his neck. And I was pretty much at that stage when Dan and I were making a different film with Idris Elba together. And I remember very clearly telling Dan about this story and this guy I'd found. And Dan, well, Dan's a huge music fan, and he can speak to that himself. But I think it really captured his imagination, and we decided to make a film together.
Let's ask Dan about his interest. And I have this question for you as a director also, because usually when you make a film about music, you make it about something else. And you discover that other thing, this kind of hidden subject and topic, the other story within the story. When you heard about him and when you heard his music, something already clicked like that, or you just needed to, meet him and start to work on the film to discover that this film is actually about something else also for you? And if it was something like that, what was this movie about for you, apart from the music and musician?
Well, to start with, it was one of those stories that already had a built-in interesting background to it. Because apart from, the albums made by people like Johnny Cash, I'd never heard of anyone making an album in prison who was actually a prisoner. It was usually people going into prisons. There was a bit of a trend for it in the 60s that I think Johnny Cash actually started. And so the idea of somebody actually incarcerated and making an album there was quite extraordinary. But I think as a director, you often just follow your nose with something that feels interesting, and hopefully, usually there's something under that that's even more interesting. And with Ike, or David Maestro, or all the other names he was, there was not just the other story, but there was countless others. And in fact, there was almost too much to put in one film, because there's a whole side to his life that we discovered a bit later on, that he was a big porn star in Germany, for instance. His connections with, possibly with Obama, which we never got to the bottom of, but he apparently played piano in the White House and smoked a joint in the White House grounds. There's all these stories which we were sort of, as filmmakers and journalists, just trying to extract what the truth might be. And in the end, it became more about his truth, because we only had those few interviews I got when I was living with him. We let him tell his story, and then we sort of unpicked it with the people that he knew to find out what the truth was. And in the end, I think we probably just told one portion of his story, because I'm sure there's lots of other versions.
This is such a multifaceted personality. Like, he's a multi-instrumentalist, but at the same time, there is so many layers and faces of him, because of course, during the action of the film, we discovered that, okay, he had another life, and now you tell me about the German porn star, that I was like, you couldn't see it, but I was like,
yeah,
because there's another
yeah,
because there's another level to this. But like, when you make a film, it's always this connection between this personal story and more political or more like wider approach. Did you feel that this life of his and those changing, and that's also a question to you both, because I guess both of you have some angle on that. Did you feel that actually he's representing something more than only himself? I'm asking that because yesterday, as I mentioned to you before we went online, we talked about the relationship between music and film, and the strong topic was political issues if it comes to making films about music, that usually there is some political angle and you want to put it in the film, and it's like that with yours. So I wonder how important was that for you to put him in the wider context of social changes and changing times in America, because that's for me, it's a movie also about that.
No, I think you're right, and I think I'll pass over to Vivian now, because it really was a film about ex-prisoners navigating in the outside world, which is never easy. But some people are able to rebuild life and others don't. But I'm going to pass on to Viv, because the political aspect is something that grew later on as well. Over to you, Viv.
Over to you, Viv. That was nice.
I feel like an
Hello,
anchorman
Viv.
on TV.
Oh yeah, she's there.
Over to you, Viv.
Thanks, Dan.
You heard the political aspect, because that's really interesting for me. Can you develop on that, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think the political aspect of the film, I mean, he was a political man, and political with a big P as well. He is a politicized individual, in as much as he talks about his experiences of racism early on in his life mean that he marches with Martin Luther King. He's also a witness to huge moments of political history, even though he's inside the prison. Something that we touch on lightly, and again, as Dan said, we could have gone into more deeply, is that he was shaped by the movement within prisons at that time, for them to be a place of rehabilitation rather than just sort of a penalization of the crimes you've committed. So I think in terms of him as a caricature, if you like, he was politicized, and I don't think that ever left him. And I suppose the role of music within the film was that music was his voice. It was his way to be heard. And it's funny, it feels even more prescient now than it did when we started making the film back in 2014, because you think about the fact that he had to use the music to be actually acknowledged, and for his story not to go unheard. So I think it works on quite a few levels politically.
Yeah, I would actually add the thing that got me thinking, especially with the situation now in US and all the violence and rebellion and Black Lives Matter movement, that sometimes if you want to escape the vicious circle of violence, you have to stop being yourself and start a new life, being a Black man in America. Because that's what I was actually thinking, that the only escape for him wasn't to come back to life and lead the life that he kind of started, because this kind of, he was marked. So the only thing to take the mark away was to start to be a different person. That's more like a comment than a question that I have, because we actually have already a few questions from the audience. But yes, please.
Well, all I was going to say is I think one of the most important thing that Dan and I grappled with when we made the film is that we really didn't want to make a film that was simplistic in terms of the relationship of music and a path to redemption, that kind of Hollywood, Disney-fied, neat, tight in a bow kind of ending where it's like a guy has a troubled life, he finds music and everything's okay. Because what really I felt acutely, and I think I speak for Dan here as well, is that Ike was completely shaped and in many ways thwarted by the experience he had as the racism he encountered, and then I think he had PTSD from being in prison, that he was never really okay again. And that is a comment on the fact is you can't expect people, and in this context, a young Black man to go through that experience and come out whole and adjusted. It shapes you and it informs your perspective and the way you deal with the world. I think that's really important. And the fact that his story ended in suicide is also, I think, is something that we should give pause to, because he was never able to really, on some level, come to terms with everything, I think.
Yeah, I guess you are exactly right with this interpretation of his story. But let's switch to the questions from the audience, because there is one that I actually wanted to ask, and that helps me to jump on the train to form that you used. Because you said yourself that there is a lot of story and stories that you can use to make a story about Ike'a White'a. And also you use a lot of different type of filmmaking. There's animation, and the question that I have in here is also about the animation and about the way to structure this kind of story. That was more my part, that when there's somebody who is so multifaceted, how do you try to follow that with the filmmaking? And also one of our viewers, Dominika, is asking about the animation, why you choose, because that's what she observed, that in the more traumatic moments of his life, you use animation. That was her view on the film. And if it was the idea that you had from the beginning that there's going to be those part of animation, or it developed within the project. So that's those two questions in a way connected. So maybe then.
I think it's I think it's something that did develop, because I've never used animation before myself, but what I like about animation when it's used right is it does something that archive can't do, because it creates an imagined space that you're able to question. Is it true? Is it not true? And it takes you straight into a subjective state of your character, rather than something that you're imposing with a reconstruction, drama reconstruction, or archive. And with Ike, we were trying at first in the edit, we were trying with archive from the time, and it just felt like we were imposing something, because we weren't sure about half the things Ike was saying. Are they true? Are they not true? We can't check them out. They're not on the internet. And I liked the idea of just immersing ourselves in his world. And instead of, say, when he's trying to get away in a car chase and shooting guns, instead of just using some rather cheesy 70s archive of police car chases, I thought I'd rather go into the kind of psychedelic mind of Ike. And that's when we started playing around with the idea of animation and did lots of tests. And it took a long time to get the style right. But that was the process anyway. It was a consequence of trying to internally work out his story.
And it works a bit like an essay, or of course, also when you try to tell a story about the person who is, as you said, you never know where's the truth and where is the reality, especially that the people that you talk with, they are not sure themselves. It's always this kind of, game of trying to really get to the truth. So from my perspective, and I guess also that's why what motivated the question, that you have all those visions and all those sources, and it makes you feel that, okay, nobody's really sure and we never will, so let's just try maybe. And this process of trying feels like a good answer to this. What do you think, Vivian, about that kind of approach?
Yeah, I think also there was the actual experience of dealing with Ike was when, you know, normally when you speak to somebody and you look them in the eye, you kind of get a sense of somebody, and you get a sense of who they are, and you have a bit of a read on them. And my experience of him was, I mean, that butterfly motif that runs through the film is a works on lots of levels, but for me especially, the experience of actually trying to understand him and spend time with him was like grasping at a butterfly, and you never quite caught him or had a full sense of him. And you're right, visually, I think the film does the same. And also, he's a chameleon, and it's a patchwork of lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the form follows that also. So I have another question, and it's actually one that I would ask. So great audience we have today. So it's about the women, actually, because at some point in time the film focuses on Lana, and then we are able to meet the other women from turmoiled life of Ike'a White'a. So let me just briefly translate, because it's in Polish, so I want to do the live translation. So this is interesting that at some point in time I feel that the history of those females that are around him is more in the focus of the filmmakers, and he is only in the background to show how strong and how interesting they were. I don't know if it was the filmmakers aimed at, but or maybe the females were just so great. So how would you comment on that? Because for me, it's also a film about all those beautiful, strong, and interesting females at some point in time. And as Dan said, there could be another film, and I would watch a film about Lana, for example. So, what do you think about what our viewer? It's again, it's Dominika. What she thinks about the strong females around Ike'a White'a. I don't know, Dan, Vivian. Who wants to speak?
I mean, it's a good question, because I think it's that is what happened. I mean, without the, it was a genuine situation where we had started a film with a main character who then checked out, and so you're left with these kind of fragments. And he'd sort of given us a sort of a trail of breadcrumbs, because he'd given all this archive to look into. It's almost like you tell the rest of the story with this, and the people in that archive are the people you see, or the wives who had these different lives with him, and it becomes about them as much as it does about them. And so I feel like I'm drifting off the question. But it became sort of a road movie, a sort of Lana's road movie, trying to discover who this man was, because he had kept himself quite quiet in each of these relationships. He'd kept himself to himself and hadn't given up the other part of his life to all these women. So it was sort of self-discovery for them as well, to meet each other.
I think also, I think it was interesting, you sort of have this journey where for each woman, I mean, on a very sort of cynical level, he needed somebody to support him, and they're strong women, and he chose strong women because they were able to hold him, because, early on in the film, Lana says, he's the artist, he doesn't live life the way I do, I'm his manager. And, he chose a succession of women who were able to, provide a framework in a similar way to the way prison did, that gave him some sort of routine and normality. You got the sense that he would have completely drifted. But the most fascinating woman in his life for me is this mother figure, who we meet right at the end of the film, which was I mean, I still, every time we watch that film again, I'm like, this is bonkers. Like, that he stayed with this woman for the longest. He was with that lady hiding out in a retirement community in Oxnard. I think it was Oxnard. For that was the most sustained relationship he had, and it didn't rely on sex. And I just find that fascinating. And there's clearly some sort of psychological review you could do on needing a mother figure, basically, I think.
Yeah, and that's also really great that you have all of them together in a way, talking about like exchanging the experiences and like building this kind of, I don't know, community of females that can understand each other because they kind of met the same person at different points of time and different ideas of him, who he actually is. But like from those stories, you can get to some kind of a truth about the man himself. We also have another question from Joanna about the music, because as I mentioned before, it's really hard to get to music of Ike'a White'a. But were you thinking that it's going to be maybe possible to rediscover his albums or the music that he played? Were you maybe thinking about it? That's the question. If there's going to be some release or re-release, and if I'm going to find this music on Spotify one day.
Viv? Hopefully.
It's possible. It's possible. I think there's the album, and then there's also the music that's in the film, which isn't all of the stuff that's on the album. Super Duper Plastic Man is not on Changing Times, which is, I mean, that's just an incredible track. I think it's all possible. It's just a matter of whether Jerry Goldstein decides that he wants to re-release it and make it available on Spotify. I think there's a possibility. I don't want to be any more sort of firm than that about it.
Of course, I understand that. Mm-hmm.
Oh no, I was just going to say that one of the great breakthrough moments was, we had these few songs on the album. I mean, it's a solid album, but there's probably 4 standout incredible tracks. But we thought it would be great to hear more of him. And I mean, thanks to Jerry Goldstein, the producer, he was able to find all of these takes that they made that were kept in pristine condition, and they were just sessions and sessions in the prison that were recorded. And you've got Doggy Rauch from Santana playing bass. You've got Greg Errico who's producing and playing drums. I mean, really the elite at the time, and the best backing singers at the time who had just been just come off the back of playing with all sorts. I mean, it was an incredible moment. And if you can imagine, he's in prison, so he's rehearsing all the time. I mean, some musicians outside, they have lives they have to get on with, and he was just, all he was doing was rehearsing. So he was at his peak, and they recorded for over a year all these sessions, and they exist. Hopefully Jerry will cut those into a new super sort of, Ike special package someday.
That would be just lovely, really, because as you probably know, the story of Northern Soul and rediscovery of music for the audiences, and all those interesting labels that are excavating the underground music, and we are suddenly meeting the musicians from, for example, Africa, that were never playing in Europe, but everybody knows their songs. It can be one of those stories. It would be just amazing to be able to listen to more of his tracks. Till then, I'm gonna just put on repeat the stuff that I found on YouTube, and I already sent it to some of my friends who are digging through music of this type. So I hope that there's gonna be audience also for this, for his music. But I'm not worried, because it's just plainly amazing, as you said before. So I guess we need to come slowly to the end of our meeting. I just discovered, Dan, that you have Black Hole on your bookshelf. Me too. It's an amazing comic book. So I was just looking at the background. Yeah, it's amazing, and I really love it. So thank you for...
Make a great movie, wouldn't it?
Oh God, yes, TV series even.
Yeah, wouldn't it be good?
Make it. You have a great
I will.
producer. Go
Make
for
it.
it. Go for it. Go for it. Thank you for being here with us. I hope that we're going to have a chance to meet one day and talk about your new project based on Black Hole, the comic book. In the meantime, have a great afternoon, and I hope that the film's going to find its way to the audiences and the music's going to be released sooner or later, so we can all listen to the changing times. And I hope that, of course, because that's, I need one comment more. Today I had a conversation about the impact that the popular culture and documentary filmmaking, TV series and music can have on the changing times that we live. It was concerning the situation in US. And I hope that films like yours is also part of that, because we can see the life of a person, which is more than this, because the stories are just developing in front of our eyes. So thank you for this once again. And I hope that we really going to have a chance to meet one day. And now I need to do a screenshot. So wave please to the camera. Great. Thank you once again. And we are going back to the studio. Dziękuję Państwu bardzo.